Yeah, so it's easier to save them from.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, bro. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Wonderful to see you, as always. I'm going to wait maybe, another 60 seconds just because I'm always conscious of the exact timing so that when the video turns on for the online folks, I don't want to be like in the middle of a sentence and have them emailing me wondering what they missed. And then I'll email back and say, you missed me saying, good morning, everyone. So. We have a guest, Natalie, right? First time. It's a weird day, only I'm saying that self-consciously because part of our day today we're going to talk about a book I wrote. I just want you to know that we don't do that every week. This is actually the only week where we're going to do that the entire semester. She's going to be like, I went to visit there, and all we did was just talk about the professor's book. Yeah, we talk about other people's books too. We happen to be talking about one I wrote today. All right, so we'll make a start. Online folks, welcome. Good to not see you, but to be seen by you, as always. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit in more detail about. So last Tuesday, we talked about the Beatitudes sort of as a general list, right? The Macarisms, they're sometimes called. We talked about them sort of as a general list. Today we're going to talk about one in particular just to sort of zero in on one to give an example of how we might read it. And then obviously, as you all know, then towards the end of our time, we'll talk a little bit about the book as well. And I'm interested in some of your feedback on it, what you think of it. Obviously, when you write your reader report on it, I'll get more details on that. But it's not so much about me wanting to hear from you all what you think, because I'll get that on the reader report, but my hope is that you're helpful to each other in the way that you sort of downloaded and processed the information. So, as we talk about this one beatitude, Matthew 5:5, and if you want to turn to Matthew 5 with me, we're going to bounce around Matthew a little bit as we look through this beatitude, because, as you would have seen by reading the book, my conviction is that the Beatitudes are explicated by lots of things going on throughout the whole text, right? So it's a way of reading it, not the way of reading it, but to me, a way of reading the Beatitudes is through sort of a narrative analysis of how the Beatitudes fit very particularly into the text of Matthew itself, as opposed to thinking about them as more generally wide, broad teaching. So again, we'll look at this one example, but to use an example we're not going to talk about in detail today, if you want to think about mourning, so the Beatitude that is blessed are those who mourn. There is a way to approach that by just looking at the word mourning, and maybe you would do a word study. Word studies are inherently deeply flawed, but we still, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways. I'd love to get into that sometime. There's this principle, this guy named James Barr wrote about this in the 1960s, and 60 years later, everybody still agrees with him. There's this principle that he called, you don't have to remember this, but he called it the totality transfer fallacy. And what he means by that is by taking the total way that a word is used or defined, and then fallaciously transferring all of the package of those definitions into every use of that word, right? So it'd be like looking at the word righteous, thinking about all the things that the word righteous might mean, and then saying, well, then that's what this use of the word righteous in this verse means. It means all that stuff. So it's been explained as like a snowball rolling down a hill and collecting debris, right? And so a word, as it travels through time and is used in various contexts, picks up meanings and connotations along the way. And so if you have a word used, the word used righteous in the Torah, and then the word again is used in a prophet, and then the word again is used in Matthew, and then again in Paul, there a lot of time is passing as the word is sort of making its way through history, and it's picking up connotations and ideas along the way. And it's fallacious, meaning incorrect, right, to take all of those hundreds of years of meanings and connotations and then go to like where Jesus uses it in Matthew and then just dump all of that on every time he uses the word. What you have to really do is think about the way that a word by itself actually doesn't even mean anything. Words only have meaning when they're interanimated by the words around them, right? That's a bizarre, maybe the way a poet might describe what we call reading in context, right? Like all these words are interanimating one another to provide meaning in the context in which you find it. And so what you might do with a beatitude is look at like, blessed are those who mourn, and say, well, what is mourning meant everywhere it's used in the Bible? And this is why word studies are deeply flawed, and why I actually tend to tell, like preachers like to do them a lot, right? Like, well, this word in the Bible means, what do you mean by this word means this in the Bible? Where in the Bible? Which author was using it, and how were they using it, and why were they using it in the way that they were using it? And different authors in the Bible even use the same word in different ways. You can't just say that there's one biblical meaning for a word when it's used in texts that span hundreds of years and different contexts. It's like, well, that text was written in Judea, and that text over there was written in the Jewish diaspora, and that one over there was written to a community in the Greek world, and whatever, right? Like, all of this has to be thought about and considered as we think about what words mean and how they're being used in different texts by different writers at different times. So what you could do is say, well, what is mourn, the word mourn, how has it been used, and what is it meant in all these biblical texts? And I think a lot of interpreters do it that way. So when I wrote my book on the Beatitudes, I could obviously read probably in the hundreds of them, articles and books and whatever. And there is tons of them that would just say, like, well, the word mourn just means this, so that's what Jesus means. But they're just giving a very general, almost generic definition of the word, something you can pull out of a dictionary. Even if it's a good Greek dictionary, that still is very problematic to just yank a general meaning and then just say, well, that's what it means, so that's what Jesus meant. So what I try to do, and there are limitations to my approach as well, but what I try to do is talk about what mourning looks like in the Gospel of Matthew and use the text of Matthew to explain what Jesus meant when he taught these Beatitudes in the text of Matthew. That makes sense, right? So do we see Jesus himself mourning anywhere in the text? Well, we do. Matthew 23, he mourns over the state of Jerusalem, right? And so if he's mourning over the state of Jerusalem, he's mourning that there are things in the world that are wrong that need to be made right again. And he's mourning about the sort of sins that have overtaken his own people, which obviously relates all the way back to Matthew chapter 1. Again, what did it say in Matthew 1? We talked about this a few weeks ago. And after the genealogy, it says that Jesus came, to save his people from their sins. And so the sins of the people sort of then dominate through the entire course of the text. It's a narrative feature in the text, and you get to toward the end of the text in Matthew 23, and he's looking out over Jerusalem as a city that had lost its way, and he's mourning over the state of things. And so I try to then take that kind of very specific view of mourning and say, at the very least, we can say that Matthew probably had that kind of thing in mind. Now, did he have more than that in mind? Maybe. Can we apply it more widely than that? Maybe. I'm going to give you an example after we talk about Matthew 5:5 of a book written in the Ukraine, in the midst of the Ukrainian-Russian war, that I only found out about it because it used mine. So they used my book a lot and quoted it in the context of it, like helping them to make sense of what they were experiencing, right? And so they're quoting things like mourning and peacekeeping and all of that. And so I'm going to share a quote with you of the way that one of the Ukrainian scholars is sort of applying the Beatitudes to their own context. And I just think it's a really interesting way of still trying to apply these things to our own world and the way that we experience the world and all of that. It's certainly appropriate for us to do that, and we should do that. But I also think that when we're looking at least for the initial meaning of the words and the way that they're being used by Jesus in the text, situating them within the text itself is probably the easiest way to come up with a responsible definition for what these things mean. And also when you see with peacemaking, the word Jesus uses for peacemaking there is what's called a hapax legomena. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the New Testament or the entire Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, right, we call it. The word is not in the biblical literature anywhere. It's found one time, and it's in the Beatitudes when Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. It's the only time that word exists. So how in the world are we going to try to define a word that can't have a dictionary definition, at least in terms of like a Bible dictionary? I mean, the word, you can go to like Greek dictionaries of the ancient world and see how they would have used similar terminology, but it's very, very hard to define a word when you don't have other examples of it. But actually, if you look within the Gospel of Matthew, then maybe you can start to make sense of it. So that's kind of the approach that I tend to take. So I think with meekness, it's the same. That's the one we're going to look at more closely this morning before we get to the reading. And then at the end of our time, we'll talk a little bit about the book and download it a little bit with one another. But that's the approach that I want to take. So the meek will inherit the earth. Again, because you should have read it by today, you would have already read a lot of this, but it's just a way for us to set the stage by talking through one of these in detail, and then we'll unpack the rest together. So what does it mean to be meek? Meekness is, we talked about the fact that some scholars trip up, and just interpreters in general trip up over the idea that some of these Beatitudes sound like negative circumstances that you would wish to avoid, and that you then hope God will reverse in the eschaton. The argument I make is that none of them are that, right? Well, I do say in the book that I think that some of them are negative circumstances that God will reverse, but that we should still pursue doing them, right? I try to nuance it that way. Like, in other words, mourning. Should we, in the eschaton, do we want to continue to have to mourn over things? Of course not. Like, there's going to come a time, Revelation, like all mourning will be wiped away. And we long for that and hope for that, and it's a beautiful picture of the recreation and renewal of all things, and Jesus hints at that in Matthew itself, in Matthew 19. We're going to talk about that after you guys have your break next week. In Matthew 19, Jesus uses a word that's only used twice in the whole Bible, once by Jesus in Matthew 19, and once in Titus chapter 3 it's used, which is a word that just means something like renewal. So in Matthew 19, Jesus' thing is, he says to the disciples, at the renewal, he doesn't clarify that, just at the renewal, you 12 disciples will sit on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Everything about that is difficult to wade through, so we'll make some sense of it together. But there is this renewal coming, the renewal and refashioning of all things, right? And so we long for that, but so we know that mourning is something that in the renewal we would assume is no longer going to happen. But it's also, though, the case that even though it's a thing that in the eschaton won't be necessary, it's also not only a negative circumstance to be avoided, it's something that we can also, in this life on this side of heaven, actively enter into. So the way that I say it in the book is that we should seek to mourn that which our Savior mourns. So if Jesus mourns over something, then it becomes a virtuous disposition to enter into that state of mourning with him and mourn alongside of him. Right? And that's what discipleship is. It's just following your rabbi around, your teacher around, your master around, and just doing what he does. So Jesus does stuff, and our job is to like we're like the child following around their parents, trying to like learn the world by mimicking them and imitating them. On a human level, that doesn't always go well, right? It's like a whole, by the way, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. It's like a whole genre of videos on like TikTok and Instagram now, of like parents videotaping their like 2-year-olds saying and doing wildly inappropriate things. And you know that the reason the 2-year-old is doing that is because they learned that from mom and dad. Thankfully, we, in Jesus, as we imitate him, we have a better model than that, right? You couldn't make videos of people doing wildly inappropriate things by imitating Jesus. But that's the deal of being a disciple, is you just follow Jesus around. I had a professor who said it this way, that your job as a disciple before mission, like missional theology is such a big and important thing, and I agree with that. But before mission, the job of the disciple is to sit at the feet of Jesus so that you can then tell the world what you see, right? So that's what a disciple is. We're sitting at the feet of Jesus to tell the world what we see. And so there's a way in which, even if mourning is not something we necessarily want to have to do, Jesus did it and he modeled it for us, and so we enter into his mourning, and then by doing that, it becomes a virtuous thing we should pursue. You want to cultivate the behavior of being a mourner about the state of the world and the things that have been made wrong that need to be made right again. Meekness is one of the, and I talked about how mourning feels like a negative one. Then you have peacemaking, which very much is the opposite. Nobody would go, oh, I don't want to have to be a peacemaker. I hope, right? Like, I mean, yes, we won't have to peacemake in the eschaton either, but it feels more like a virtuous disposition to enter into than maybe being in a state of mourning. Nobody wants to walk around just dripping with sadness all the time. And I don't think that's what mourning means, right? I'm sure Jesus had a really good time in his life. But, you get the point. Like, there's some of these feel like more negative than others. Meekness is one of those ones that stands right in the middle for a lot of people, because it entirely depends on exactly how you read or interpret the concept of being meek. Some think meek like meek and lowly, like, just another way of saying something like Poverty of spirit, which is also another beatitude, Matthew 5:3, to be poor in spirit. People think of poor in spirit as sort of a depressive state. My argument is that that's not what that means. Or that meekness is like meek and mild and lowly, of like walking around sort of, in a depressive state all the time. And I would argue also with meekness, and I do as you read, that that's very not what meekness means. Jesus himself is described in the Bible as meek, and in Matthew itself, he describes himself as meek. We'll talk about that in a minute, and then Matthew describes him as meek in a separate occasion. So Jesus is described as meek twice after he tells his disciples to be meek, or blessed are the meek. So again, if Jesus is meek, then we're modeling meekness after Jesus. So first of all, that tells us it's a virtuous disposition to enter into, not a negative connotation to be avoided. And then we have Jesus doing it, so we have the model for what it looks like to then enter into meekness and cultivate it. So, meek is a word that generally refers to those who are humble and reliant upon God. It is very similar to poverty of spirit, and there are some scholars in older commentaries especially that have, good to see you, there are some scholars in older commentaries especially that have argued that poverty and spirit and meekness are essentially synonymous. I don't think that's the case. I think they're just different enough that we should pull different connotations from them. But there is some similarities to them, right? They do describe sort of a state of humility, complete and open reliance upon God, coming to God open-handed and empty-handed and saying, I am relying on you for everything I need for life and for godliness. Moses himself, though, is described in the Greek version of the Hebrew text. He's described by the same word, right? So he is also humble, meek in Numbers 12. Those who are meek are those who obey God and seek righteousness. That should also be an indicator. And by the way, a lot of these Beatitudes, they sort of flow together and do share a lot in common. So meek is a word that is often used to describe those who seek righteousness, and there's also a beatitude that tells you to hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? So again, all of these sort of flow and connect one to the next. There's almost like a progression of, and I think there is kind of a progression. I think you could argue that there's a sense in which you have to sort of become them in order, right, to do them all well. Poverty of spirit. Why would poverty of spirit be the first one on the list? I told you guys on Tuesday that my view of poverty in spirit, and I get this from, by the way, poverty of spirit is also a hapax legomena. There is no single passage in all of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, New Testament, nowhere else is that exact phrase, poverty of spirit, used the way that Jesus teaches it in Matthew 5. And not only is it unbiblical literature, it's not even in any other Jewish non-biblical texts that we have. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a couple of instances where there's a very, very close similar phrase, which is contrite in spirit rather than poor in spirit. Very similar. It might even mean something like the same thing. But the exact phrase that Jesus uses there, poor in spirit, is found nowhere else. So again, that makes it a lot harder to interpret. If you can't find it anywhere else, you have to do a lot of harder work to figure out, well, what do these words independently mean, and then what might they mean as they, animate one another and put them together. Poverty of spirit to me, though, is like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. God, I really don't want to do this. What's about to happen sounds super painful. If you could let this cup pass for me, that'd be grand. But if not, what? Not my will be done, but your will be done. To me, that's poor in spirit. It's just coming empty-handed to God and saying, whatever your will is, whether I want to do it or not, it's irrelevant. Whatever your will is, and by the way, I'll ask, I'll bug you, or I'll bother you, but whatever your will is, I'm going to do it because that's your will for my life, right? That's poverty of spirit. That disposition, coming to God that way, is the starting point then for all the other things you need to do. What's next? Well, then you need to be able to look around at the world, at the state of things, and mourn over the state of things. In other words, allow your heart to be broken by the way the world is. There's a pastor many, many years ago who used to call that like a holy discontent. You have to stir up a discontent about the world, but not because you're a complainer or a whiner. You stir up a good discontent, a holy discontent about the way of things, and mourn over the state of things to allow the brokenness of your heart to be able to propel you forward to do the things God's called you to do, right? So then you do that. Well, then what's next? Meekness. You have to develop this humble spirit, this humble disposition that can walk through the world, move about the world in such a way where you are demonstrating the humility of God to the world around you. And we could just go down the list. They all kind of almost flow into one another. So that by the time you get to near the end, you have like peacemaking, right? You want to be a peacemaker. How can you be a peacemaker if you're not humble before God and before the people you're trying to make peace on behalf of or whatever? And you could sort of, and then you get to the end, and what's the last one? Blessed are those who move through persecution well. If the persecution comes to your doorstep, you have to be able to handle it. How do you handle it? By being the rest of the stuff on this list. That if you are these things, cultivate them. You get to persecution, don't worry, you'll be okay if you have cultivated this stuff. Yeah.
Just double checking, did you just rag on word studies and then give us a word study on me?
No, sort of. I am trying to establish the meaning of the word so that we can situate it in its context, but then we're going to do the harder work of situating in the context afterwards. If I stopped here, then yes. If I stopped here, then I would rag on word studies and then give you one, and then you would all be able to walk out and say, he has no idea what he's talking about. Because yes, this is very word study-like, but I'm going to try to take this and situate it into the text. Very good. Yeah, but again, that can become quite dangerous, right? Actually, I told you guys it was called the totality transfer fallacy. It's actually called the illegitimate totality transfer fallacy, where you try to take all the previous meanings and dump them. By the way, here's an equally a digression. I have so many digressions. I started class last semester in class you were in with a digression.
Yeah.
We did a digression before we even got to them. The illegitimate totality transfer fallacy is not just about taking the whole total meaning of something and dumping it on every individual use of a word. There's the opposite problem, which is then looking at all the things a word can mean, but then just choosing the one definition you like best and falling in love with it and assuming it always means that because that's the one you want it to mean, right? Like, I really like when righteousness only means this. So every time any New Testament writer uses the Greek word for righteousness, I'm just going to say it means that every time. When righteousness can refer to something given to you as a gift, it can refer to behavior you're expected to cultivate. It can refer to neither of those, but something more like justice being served. It can refer to so many different things depending on the context, but sometimes we fall in love. And I think in Protestant circles, especially in Reformed ones, it's often like an imputed righteousness. We fall in love with that idea and then just think it always means that, when actually it probably means that less often than it means something like lived behavior. And it also means something like justice to be done a lot, the same Greek word. So you have to really do the hard work of saying, when does it mean one of these things, rather than falling in love with one definition and then just implanting that into every time you read it. Anyway, yes, you led me towards another digression, but it was a good one. All right, so meekness often refers to something like refraining from anger or wrath and showing patience for God's timing, right? So you might be justified in showing anger towards something, but choosing to refrain from that is kind of what meekness often refers to. Jesus, again, uses the same word to describe himself as gentle and humble or meek of heart. Anyone know where that is? Pretty famous passage, Matthew 11, right? When he talks about the yoke, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He uses the exact same word of himself. So if Jesus is meek and then he says, blessed are the meek, he's not saying, hey, it stinks to be meek, but don't worry, you will be blessed, God's got your back. That's how some people read it. It's Jesus is saying, I am meek, and what it means for me to be meek, I want you to do that. That's, I think, more what he has in mind. Deidre Good wrote a really helpful, very short little book on the concept of meekness in relationship to royalty in the ancient world, super helpful, where she demonstrated that meekness is a common virtue connected to Greek and Roman ideas of kingship. And she has, in a very short book, dozens and dozens and dozens of helpful examples. And I, in the book, give you a few very short ones. But there's this idea that in the ancient world, the exact same word, praus, that's used for meekness here, is also connected to meekness by ancient Greek philosophers in terms of the concept of royalty and their own desire for their own kings. So Aristotle talked a lot about the need for this kind of meekness for Greek kings who would rule Greek lands. The idea that they were longing for kings who would behave according to this kind of meekness. Rulers were expected to be meek, and what it meant for that, for Aristotle anyway, was that they would be unbothered by troubling circumstances. They were against tyranny and benevolent and compassionate towards their citizens. So even if we have a very cursory knowledge of the ancient world, you could probably mentally run through the history of the Greek and Roman world and say how many kings of the really ancient world, or even into the sort of reign of the Caesars, how many of them could we probably have defined this way? And the list is, I would say, very, very short. If we can provide any names at all, the list would be very, very short, right? Like Marcus Aurelius was known for, in a lot of ways, being meek in this respect, and he was also like a war-torn Caesar who conquered lands, while he was known for being a pretty meek and humble dude, right? So even the ones that are known for this have blood on their hands all over the place. It's very hard to go through history at any point in time and find rulers who are unbothered by troubling circumstances and are against tyranny and are benevolent and compassionate towards their citizens. I mean, by the way, even Nero, when the city of Rome burned, we talked about this in our Revelation class, even when the city of Rome burned, Nero spent some money from the coffers in Rome to bring in provisions to help people who had lost their homes. But this is the same guy that sicked wild dogs on Christians and had them mauled to death in streets, and murdered his own mother and lit people on fire and put them on stakes to light the gardens at night, right? Like, this guy was a tyrannical, evil tyrant who also happened to provide food and water to people after a fire broke out and destroyed their houses. So even those who do a good thing from time to time in history certainly can't be described as meek, you would think. Hellenistic kings were expected to show forgiveness rather than retribution, and forbearance rather than anger. Anger and meekness were considered opposites. So this is a word study to at least give us an ancient context for how the word often was used. And it pretty typically then was just a word that was an antonym of the concept of anger. Which, by the way, it's used that way in the psalm that Jesus quotes when Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." All of that except the Makarios, the word for blessed, is actually a direct quote from Psalm 37, although he quotes it from the Greek, which in the Greek, it's not Psalm 37. The Greek Psalms are off. Most of them are off by a number. So the Greek version was, to them, Psalm 36. But the verses are the same. So 36:11 in the Greek, 37:11 in the Hebrew. A similar phrase is used in that one psalm like 5 times. But it's most closely directly associated with verse 11, where it says, "The meek will inherit the earth." So Jesus then adds the Makarios to the beginning to put it into a beatitude and says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And in that psalm, it also then talks about avoiding anger. So in the psalm that Jesus is quoting from, meekness and anger are juxtaposed with one another. So sometimes the best way to define something is to think about its opposite. So if anger is its opposite, then the meekness is, we can define it in a positive way, but negatively it's just the avoidance of this other thing. Meekness sits alongside what is good, kind, just, gentle, and merciful. And of course we have a beatitude, "Blessed are the merciful," right? Those who show mercy. And mercy also is on Jesus' mind, you can say, in Matthew, and probably has something to do with meekness. So again, that's where we go beyond the word study and start to really integrate it into the context of the text as a whole. Because meekness sits alongside of mercy. And Jesus has another beatitude where he says, "Blessed are the merciful." And mercy is, I would even say, probably the dominant motif in the entire Gospel of Matthew. Right? What do the blind often yell to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew? "Have mercy on me, Son of David." Right? And then what does Jesus say twice in Matthew and none of the other Gospels, by the way? Only in Matthew. What does he say twice to the scribes and Pharisees when he says, "Go and learn what this means"? Go and learn what this means. "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," which is a direct quote of Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. So this idea, and by the way, and I think I mentioned this in class already, but before we even get to Jesus, if you look at Joseph, why does Joseph decide to divorce Mary quietly when he finds out she's pregnant? Because he wants to show her mercy. So this idea of mercy is like littered throughout the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew himself as a writer, even more than Mark and John, Luke also shows a really huge tendency towards quoting particular teachings of Jesus related to mercy. So I would say the two side by side kind of exist in that space. But Matthew has a very particular concern for mercy that not every other writer in the New Testament has. So you can then more easily, I would say, go beyond the word study and into the narrative study to import that into what meekness might mean, because that's a concern of the way that Jesus lives and moves through Matthew's text, right? And so, you start to do that sort of thing to chip away at a meaning. How is this being used in this text in particular? Matthew's gospel opens with Herod, who is none of the things I just described, right? He is a Roman client king. Josephus, ancient Jewish historian, a Jewish historian who wrote his histories on behalf of the Romans, but he was Jewish. Josephus explains that Herod was known for outbursts of anger, that he suffered from instability. That's in his book Antiquity of the Jews. He held grudges, slaughtered his enemies, and even members of his own family, and used savage techniques to solidify his power. So if you want to look at from Aristotle all the way up to Jesus, what they were longing for when they were looking for a good, merciful, meek king, Matthew very early on not only talks about mercy as the positive disposition that we're supposed to cultivate, but he immediately at the very beginning of the text gives us an opposite example with Herod, which, by the way, another thing that you can start to sort of chip away at meaning here. Matthew talks about Herod a whole lot more than any of the other gospel writers, and very in particular, the way that Herod functions in the infancy stories of Jesus are only found in Matthew and nowhere else. So when Herod decides, for example, to slaughter the infants of Bethlehem in order to try to kill Jesus, that story is in Matthew and it's not in any of the other Gospels, because Matthew's particular concern is that he's juxtaposing the meek King Jesus with this very not meek King Herod, right? Like they're being put side by side through the text as the theme of Matthew's Gospel. So in Matthew, Herod exhibits rage-filled jealousy concerning the birth of the King of the Jews and slaughters infants to get rid of it, Matthew 2:1-18. Conversely, Matthew uses the word meek not only to describe himself, but specifically to describe him as a meek king. Actually, I want to read the two passages really quickly. Let's go back to Matthew 11, which I mentioned a second ago. I think it's easy to read it. And then we'll read Matthew 21 as well, the first part. So in Matthew 11, for wider context, I'll just start in verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Which, by the way, that's interesting, right? Like, certainly exegetical work needs to be done to unpack exactly what he means by infants. But you hide things from the wise to reveal them to infants. I don't think he obviously means like you only reveal them to children. He's sort of juxtaposing the concept of infancy in terms of wisdom versus those who say or think they are wise. But Jesus is using these kinds of analogies a lot in Matthew, and then there are stories where he also then welcomes the little children in ways that he doesn't welcome others. There's the story, well, actually I think I have a slide where I'll mention it quickly, but where the children are coming around to try to bug Jesus, and the disciples are like, shoot, go away, right? And Jesus is like, no, bring them on in, let them come, right? Which I have a pastor, when I was a pastor, I have a pastor friend who used to use that passage a lot to try to like guilt the congregation into signing up for children's ministry. It's like, see, Jesus wanted to hang out with the kids, why don't you? But like this idea that Herod wanted to kill all these infants to get rid of Jesus, and Jesus is the opposite. He's welcoming the kids in and saying, hey, gather around, right? So again, these juxtapositions, Matthew's using them over and over and over again. And he's not drawing attention to them explicitly and saying, hey, I'm telling you about Herod so that when I tell you about Jesus, he's not preaching at you, but he's very much expecting us as the ideal reader to be able to unpack all of these juxtapositions as we move through the text. All right, so verse 26, yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. By the way, all these things have been handed over to me by my Father. What does he say in Matthew 28 of the Great Commission when he sends out the disciples? He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So there is this sense in which we certainly understand that God has always been sovereign. He never surrendered his sovereignty and his control over all things. And there's a sense, as we talk about kingdom in this class, right now, as we're kind of walking through that every week, there's still a sense in which, as humans who were supposed to be vice regents on God's behalf over creation, as we surrendered that through the fall, there is a sense in which God, who is sovereign, still sends Jesus to wrestle away control from the powers of darkness. So there's a sense in which God is always in control, and a sense in which evil has free reign in a way that needs to be reined in by the coming of Christ. So when he says, repent, for the kingdom of God has come near or is in your midst, what he's saying is there's a way in which, despite God's ongoing sovereignty, there's a way in which something wasn't really in control of goodness and righteousness, and I've come to wrestle the kingdom away from the powers of darkness and give it back to those of you who were supposed to have it, but surrendered it at the fall, right? Like, we're going to get into more of that in Romans 8. It becomes very prominent in Romans 8. The language of glory in Romans 8 is not referring to some sort of future eschatological glory. It's talking about us being returned to the glory of Adam, which is actually just another way of saying vice regency with God as stewards over creation. And we're being re-elevated to a position we were created to have and to possess, but that we lost. So Jesus is kind of wrestling control away from the powers of darkness so that he can then say to us, hey, remember that vice regency that was given to Adam that they lost in the garden? I wrestled that all back for you, and I'm giving you another shot. But this time you have the power of the Spirit of God, and so success is inevitable, right? So all of that language, the more you see it as a dominant theme of the New Testament, you can see hints of it where Jesus says things like, all authority has been given to me, right? He's wrestling control away from darkness. He's pushing back against the darkness with everything that he does. I think all of his miracles can be interpreted in that light. His miracles are taking things that have been made wrong and making them right again. He's pushing back against the darkness, right? All right, so then verse 28, come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So that's where he refers to himself by the same word that we find meekness in the Beatitudes. But then you flip to chapter 21, and then this is very much a kingdom-oriented context, and why I would insist that this is meant to juxtapose with Herod. So Herod is not meek at all, right? Again, he's wrestling power away from others, and he's a tyrant who is using his power to hold on to his power. Well, what do we have of Jesus in the triumphal entry in Matthew 21? It says, when they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied to a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately. This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you. So kingdom context, your king is coming to you. Humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So the word there for humble is the same word that is found for meekness in the Beatitude. So Jesus calls himself meek, and then he quotes prophecy to also refer to himself not just as a king, but a meek one. So there's a juxtaposition here between Jesus as the meek king and the not so meek kings that they're surrounded by. So Herod finds children expendable. Jesus welcomes them and declares that the kingdom is theirs. Hellenistic kings, again, are tyrants, but Jesus came to serve. Herod tried to kill others to hold on to power, but Jesus, surrenders his life as a ransom for many. I mean, even in that, I think it's the cross itself is a juxtaposition to what other kings would be willing to do for their subjects. Herod's thing is, hey, if I have to sacrifice somebody around here, it's not going to be me. It's going to be the rest of you so that I can keep my stuff. And Jesus is like, oh, someone has to be sacrificed? I'll do it. Right? So juxtapositions. Jesus resisted the offer of the kingdoms from an evil source, Matthew 4. We talked about that on Tuesday. When Jesus is contending with the devil in the wilderness, what does the devil say? Bow down to me and I will give you everything, all the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus says, no thanks. I mean, part of it is, of course, I came to wrestle it away from you, right? So I don't have to take it from you because I came to take it away from you. But also, what does he say? Like, I bow down to no one but my Father alone, and that sort of thing. So he resisted an offer to receive the kingdoms from an evil source, only to be given authority over all by the Father because of his own obedience. So the thing is like I can either, to the devil, again, I'm just paraphrasing wildly here, I can either receive the kingdoms of the earth from you and bow down to you, or I can obey my Father and get the kingdoms of the earth from him. And I'd rather get them from him because he's the sovereign one anyway, right? And so that's, again, the juxtapositions that are building through the text. So, by being meek, Jesus becomes what? The ideal king. And if we then become meek, we become the ideal disciples of the ideal king. The meek commit themselves to God and allow him to vindicate them, rather than using their own hubris or anger or defiance to vindicate themselves. So there's two paths there, right? You either vindicate yourself through your own behavior, or you're meek enough to avoid anger, to avoid revenge, retribution, etc., and allow God to be the one to vindicate you in the end. So the second half of this, let's look at quickly. The second half of the verse. So the first half is blessed are the meek, and then the second half is because they will inherit the earth. In Matthew 11:12, Jesus says that the kingdom has suffered violence because the violent take it by force. Now, this is actually an odd verse because I've had students in this class in past semesters who have been a part of interpretive traditions who actually interpret this verse as though this is a positive teaching for the disciples to go and do this. That we are supposed to be the kinds of disciples that forcefully take back the world for God. And I don't want to sound as though I'm disrespecting other people's traditions, but that is a sort of niche interpretation within very particular traditions that you won't find held by any scholar in any legitimately sort of any academics of the ancient world. You won't find virtually anybody who will ever read it that way.
Yeah, I've had a couple of experiences where some pastors take the scripture for warfare prayers and not praying and saying that they are maybe taking back their health by force, and I usually just get confused because I know that healing has been given to us by Jesus, and we just need to really claim it, right? And also you claim the healing, or you believe that you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've had that experience, and like, how do you?
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, my experience with it has been in classes talking about this passage and having people say that they come from traditions that interpret it that way. But yeah, so there are traditions that would say, like you just said, right? Like, well, it's all about this spiritual warfare, and we're in the middle of this warfare, and we need to sort of be aggressive and progressive and take the kingdom away from the powers of darkness. The odd thing about that is, if you really read this verse carefully in context, it actually means the opposite. It's not that we are the ones who aggressively take the kingdom back from the powers of darkness. It's that this verse is saying that the ones who are taking the kingdom aggressively are the dark ones, right? The verse is actually saying that those who are trying to violently take the kingdom are not disciples who are insisting upon taking the kingdom back from darkness. It's that this is how the dark ones operate, is by violently trying to possess the kingdom, like Herod. Herod is one who violently tried to maintain his own hold over his own kingdom. And Jesus is saying, hey, those other people are the ones who try to take it by force violently. And he teaches us about meekness because the meek are the ones who resist that. We resist aggression so that the kingdom belongs to those who are resisting aggression. It doesn't belong to those who are taking it by force. Now, there's a passage that I think, there's several passages you can use to demonstrate this, but one that I think does it really clearly. The parable of the wicked tenants. Because we have an example of opponents of Jesus who literally, in the parable that Jesus teaches, are literally trying to take the kingdom by force, right? And it's Jesus' opponents that do this, not his own disciples. So in the parable it says this: listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants. The slaves here are representatives, I think, of the prophets of old. So he sent his slaves, the prophets, his servants, to collect his produce. But the tenants seized the slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. This is just the way that the prophets were treated. Jesus reiterates this in Matthew 23, right? God sent the prophets to you, and you stoned them and killed them. Again, he sent other slaves more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Then he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. They didn't respect the prophets, but they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, listen to the language, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance. And in Matthew 5:5, what is it that we receive by being meek? An inheritance. So Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, meaning become an heir of God who receives God's stuff, right? Enter back into vice regency, the vice regency that Adam and Eve were intending to possess but lost. That if we are the meek, if we are the ones who are in relationship to God through Christ, that we then inherit the earth, right? So Adam and Eve received the earth, they were stewards over the earth. We will re-inherit what they had lost by being cast out of the garden. All this is connected, right? Well, here, it's the opponents of God who then say, well, if we kill the son, we'll get to just take the inheritance away. So what are they doing? Trying to take the inheritance, the kingdom, by force. So when Jesus in Matthew 11 says that the violent take it by force, it clearly can't be a positive comment on what disciples should go do, like you said, and like I've heard as well from people that there are traditions that would say that I interpret the verse that way. It's very much the opposite. Jesus is saying, hey, it's the people who don't do things the way that I want them to do it that are trying to violently maintain control over the inheritance. It's not your job to go and win the battle of spiritual warfare. According to Paul in Romans, all over the place, God himself wins the battle of spiritual warfare, and then he gives us the Holy Spirit to help us live the resurrected life, right? Even in Romans 16, at the very end of that letter, Paul says to the churches in Rome, he says, Romans 16, I think it's verse 20, that God himself will be the one who will crumble Satan before them, put Satan under their feet. Right? So all of that kind of warfare stuff, God's the one taking care of that work. It needs to be done, but God's the one taking care of that work. So it's the opponents of Jesus who try to wrestle things away by killing the prophets, killing the Son of God himself, to wrestle the inheritance away for themselves. And then it says what? They seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. And then if you skip down to verse 43, how do I know the inheritance and the kingdom are the same thing? Verse 43, Jesus says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces its fruits. So the people who violently try to take the inheritance, which is essentially synonymous with the kingdom itself, then Jesus says, those people will lose the kingdom. I'm going to take it away from them and give it to others. There are lots of interpretations of that. I make an argument. I think I mentioned it in this book, but I talk about it in much more detail in another one that I wrote, a whole huge chapter on it. My view of that is that this is about the Jewish leaders in particular. Some interpret this to say that it's all of Israel that is having the kingdom taken away from them and given to somebody else, usually like the church. I don't think that's right at all. I think it's just, it's not that Israel loses its benefits or privilege. It's actually on their behalf that Jesus says this, because it's the leaders who have led them astray that are then losing their share of leadership in the kingdom, and the ideal disciples are then being brought in to replace them, right? On behalf of both the church and Israel. It's not one instead of the other, it's both. And it's the leaders then who are killing the prophets and killing the Son of God and all of that. I mean, who is it really that leads ultimately to the death of Jesus? It's the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees in the text. So anyway, you can disagree with me on that part because there's a huge debate about it, but that's my take on that. But yeah.
So by that interpretive tradition, meaning like taking things back by force, is that like literally like what is it like putting the church in charge of the state and all that jazz, or is it like, or do you mean like the kind of Kuyperian like transform culture type deal? Like everybody like literally take it by force, or like metaphorically like try to transform culture?
It's a really good question. I think most of the way that I've heard it is more similar to the Kuyperian, but it's not Kuyperians I've ever heard make that argument. It tends to come a lot more from like Pentecostal traditions who are thinking of it more, not about state or culture, but in terms of spiritual warfare. So for them, it's more of like that there are spiritually oppressive forces, and that our job as the church is to take the kingdom back from them through the context of spiritual warfare.
Okay.
So I don't think it has actually to do with either of the two that you mentioned, but it's probably more similar to the sort of cultural battle. But they would see the cultural battle as not with humans, but with powers and principalities. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I was hearing that, it's like, oh, that sounds like the theonomists too. That
It can't. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the thought among theonomists is similar, but I've never heard theonomists use this verse that way. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good question, because there are lots of enemies of God in the Bible, and lots that we pretend are there that maybe aren't, and you have to sift through all these traditions and figure out what battle everyone thinks they're picking. So that's a really good question to have to think through. But I've only ever heard this Matthew 11:12 used for the sort of more spiritual battle part. Yeah,
Okay.
Cool. It's a really good question. So quickly, and then we're going to talk about the reading with our last 20 minutes or so. God's kingdom is different than earthly kingdoms. Remember, we talked about that. The reason why Matthew uses the phrase kingdom of heaven so often, when none of the other gospels do. Mark and Luke only ever call it the kingdom of God. Matthew calls it the kingdom of God 4 times, but kingdom of heaven all the rest of the time. Is because he's juxtaposing the ways of heaven and the ways of the earth. This is also then true when we talk about the juxtaposition of meek kings versus kings full of hubris and tyranny and aggression. So God's kingdom is different than earthly kingdoms. So the future earth is a promise where God's kingdom reigns upon the inherited earth. Or again, I brought up in Matthew 19 when he calls it the renewal. So there is a really big debate, ongoing debate that'll never end. I'm going to be on sabbatical in the fall, and I'm probably going to write about this while I'm on my sabbatical. This idea that the degree to which eschatology is just looking to the future and the recreation of all things, versus the degree to which it looks to the future at the recreation of all things, and then some of the biblical writers then see that being imported back into the present. Paul, I think, more clearly is often importing his vision of the future into the present. So for Paul, it's not that you will one day be resurrected, it's that baptism starts the process of you already living a resurrected life. In other words, for Paul, I'm convinced he thinks that we are all resurrected right now. You are physically going to go through the resurrection process at some other point, but you are right now a resurrected follower of Jesus, because he's taking that resurrected life and just importing it into your present reality. The degree to which Jesus is talking about that with like the renewal, right? There are some times where he talks about, and we're going to talk about this actually after the break. I'll get into some details on this. Sometimes Jesus talks about the kingdom as sort of a thing that's here now, but also very much a thing that's not here yet and is coming. And then there's a degree to which the thing that's not here that is coming is also already being kind of imported into our present reality. But a way to think about this is that as we cultivate the Beatitudes and live like Jesus in this way, we are sort of that future eschatological community, living out the ideals of the future eschatological kingdom in the present. So it's not just that we show the world what it's like to live like Jesus, it's that we show the world what it's like to live like the future renewed earth in the present time. It's like, hey, you want to know what the beautiful future reality is going to look like? The church is supposed to sort of be modeling that. I say supposed to because we all probably have various opinions about the degree to which we're doing that. But I think that's supposed to be the idea. Disciples can then take solace in the promise of a better kingdom, a better king in a better kingdom. So there's solace for the future, but I don't think we should only then say, well, I'm just waiting for the future, and so, you know, the present will be what it will be, because we're all just going to sit and wait around. Like, I think, again, the idea is to look to the better king and the better kingdom, and then say, what does that look like for us to try to be the presence of that today? Here are a few passages and ideas that I think are in the background of this. This is the last slide, and then we'll transition to the reading. I mentioned Psalm 37:11, where it says the meek will inherit the earth. Although, here's the thing, and again, even this you can kind of go back and forth and debate. In Psalm 37 or 36 in the Greek version, it's the word there can be translated as something like earth, and it can be translated as land. It's probably the case that in the Psalm, it's that the meek will inherit the land, meaning the land of Israel. and that Jesus then universalizes it to talk about a more worldwide inheritance because he's including Gentiles into the inherited space. There are some scholars who say that when Jesus quotes the psalm, he's also still only talking about Israel. Scott McKnight argued that, for example, in his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. I don't think that's true because the word there is used in Matthew like 20 times. And then when I went through, and it's not just me, other scholars have done this, Dale Allison, who I think is like the best Matthew scholar of the last 50 years, did this, and he came to the same conclusion. That if you look at the 20 or so times that the word for earth, land there, gay, is used in Matthew, 19 out of the 20 it refers to the whole earth, and only once does it probably refer to the land of Israel itself. To me, it's very much the case. And by the way, how would I also add to that? Abrahamic promise is prominent in Matthew's gospel. We talked about that last week. And the Abrahamic promise, the third aspect of that promise, is all about blessing all of the nations and not just Israel alone. So it seems to me very much that Jesus is taking the psalm and not only adding the beatitudinal context to it, but he's adding that context and then he's universalizing the promise from the inheritance of the land of Israel alone to inheriting everything. Jews and Gentiles alike, everybody that follows then Jesus is a part of a global inheritance. And then Matthew 19, when he talks about the renewal, he seems to be talking about the renewal of everything, not just a limited amount of space. Any quick thoughts or questions about that before we spend our last 19 minutes talking about the reading? Questions, thoughts, ideas, rebuttals? Happy to be wrong. Yeah.
It is related, but I've kind of had this question for a couple of days. Where our term beatitudes even comes from.
Yeah.
What that means.
So do you mean the English version of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so good. It comes from the Latin translation of that Greek verse. So when they translated the Greek New Testament into Latin translators, I think Jerome, for example, in his famous Latin translation did it this way. He used a Latin word that correlates to our English beatitude. So, and by the way, this is, while I would insist that we should all have confidence in our Greek or in our English Bibles, I insist that we have the Word of God. Translation is always, always, always an interpretive process. You are interpreting when you translate. So those who did the Latin version of the Bible, we're talking like what? Jerome was early, 5th century maybe? Trying to blank on his exact time. But when he translated the Vulgate into Latin, he interpreted this as something like a passive blessing and used a Latin word, beatus, that we then transliterated into English as beatitude, which also then lends itself to the debate around the word on whether we have been using the right one this whole time, because lots of people think it's not a passive blessing and that beatitude is just the wrong word. But again, you would create an uproar if you changed it, but that's where it came from. Yeah, it's not even drawn on a close association with the Greek word. It's drawn on reading the Greek through the Latin. Yeah. Very good. Well, I'm going to preface our conversation on the book with this. I hesitated to read this because I certainly don't want to sound like I'm like, this is a silly old man word, but tooting my own horn. But I found this and I thought it was really cool. You can't read that, so I'll just read it out loud to you. But there was a group of Bible scholars in Ukraine. Some of you might know that there was like a seminary there that had been bombed by the Russians in the current war, and there was a seminary president that had been like killed in the streets. And so, Christians themselves are sort of trying to process what they're going through. And I found this because it was brought to my attention that this book used the book that we just read. But this is the way in which this gets brought into the present world, right? So this is one of the authors in the book that does use my comments on peacemaking, then wrote this as kind of a note about his reflections on the Beatitude itself as he was processing the Beatitudes in a new way through his current lenses. And he said, the author, meaning himself, the author's biblical and theological reflections presented in this chapter were born out of a deeply personal experience, the fatal wounding of my brother, Andriy, who was a senior lieutenant of the medical service of the armed forces of Ukraine by the Russians in the Kherson region on July 6th, and his passing into eternity on July 21st, 2024, became the existential experience that radically deepened my understanding of biblical shalom, or peace, which is in the background of the concept of peacemaking. It was through personal trauma of losing my brother, who gave his life for the freedom of Ukraine, that not only a theoretical understanding, but also a practical understanding of the paradoxical nature of Christian peacemaking was born in me. Completing this work in December 2024 in Kherson during a visit to local churches, together with, and then he named some people, I hear the explosions of Russian bombs every day. These explosions become a kind of punctuation between theoretical reflections on the nature of true peace and the practical challenges of its implementation in the context of war. My prayer for a just peace for Ukraine is intertwined with the eschatological expectation of God's final shalom, which will become a reality only with the second coming of Christ. Come, Lord Jesus, is not an escape from the reality of war, but a hope for that final resurrection where the first heaven and the first earth shall pass away, and a new heaven and a new earth for eternal life awaits us. So this is an example of the kinds of things we need to process as we work through these Beatitudes, of how do they then also become practically helpful. So that's when it moves from biblical exegesis, which is more the focus of this class, and into practical theology, which you'll also obviously engage here at the seminary and lots of other classes, and the way that these things intersect. I just think it's helpful for us to be thinking about that through the lenses of people dealing with it in pretty powerful ways. So I have no guiding structure for the next 15 minutes. My hope is just that you all have thoughts, ideas, questions, whatever, and that we'll kind of lead the conversation for the next 15 minutes. But thoughts, reflections on what you read. By the way, online people, you don't necessarily have to sit here and watch us talk. You can. You don't have to. You cut away now if you choose. Anyone?
I think I had heard an interpretation of the Beatitudes is like almost purely Christocentric before. That's not the only interpretation I've heard, but that's what I've heard before, where it's like basically Christ is just talking about himself. But I appreciate how you do incorporate that, but make it a ideal disciples, sort of a whosoever is this is imitating me, but it's not as if Christ is like tooting his own horn and saying, this is just who I am, and making it purely Christocentric with no practical effect on those who are hearing it. So,
Very good. That's helpful. I don't know if you heard it in a Lutheran context, but a pretty common Lutheran reading of not just the Beatitudes, but the whole Sermon on the Mount. Well, it was common with Luther because this was Luther's reading. And then the degree to which the Lutheran tradition has maintained this or not, I'm no expert. But Luther's thing was essentially that this is all really just about Christ telling you what you should have been able to do, demonstrating that he then did it because he knows you couldn't, which causes you to have to then come before God on your knees, right? The Reformed tradition has typically not gone in that direction because then it sort of places this entire teaching before us and then just says, this is here just to tell you that you couldn't do any of it and therefore you can't do anything with it other than just be thankful to God and move on. But yeah, there is a pretty dominant reading out there that is like so Christological that only Christ does this, and he's not actually asking us to cultivate these things. But Jesus' own words are essentially through the sermon of like, go do these things, right? So, and certainly we want to avoid the opposite error. What did Tolstoy do with it, right? And I'm a big Tolstoy guy. I quote War and Peace in this book. Avid Tolstoy reader. But Tolstoy was the opposite. He so deeply literalized it that at the end of his life, he essentially just like went into a form of retreat because he was trying so hard to observe so perfectly the letter of the Sermon on the Mount that it almost like crippled his social behavior, right? So certainly I'm not saying that we should or that Jesus wants us to do that either. Dale Allison uses the phrase moral imagination, that it's more about inspiring the moral imagination towards Christ likeness than it is about, putting pressure on yourself to observe the letter to the point where it cripples you. But yeah.
Yeah, to that point, I've heard too, like a more dispensationalist interpretation where this is like a new law given to the Israelites specifically and exclusively, and they rejected him, and so this doesn't apply to us at all.
Yeah.
But to make it like a new law to that extent where we're under this pressure.
Yeah.
So
Very good.
Kind of similar to that point, just as you were talking about like at least Luther's reading, right? That kind of reminds you of like the third use of the law too, where it's like reading it Christologically in the sense that it's like that's what Christ was only able to do. Hence why we need to come to God on our knees is great, but also same way like we use the moral laws in the Old Testament. It's also like one of those things that it's a both and type deal where it's like yeah, and we should also be cultivating it. Not that we can perfectly whatsoever, but because it's good for us as well.
That's excellent because I think that lends itself a lot to Jesus's point in the 2 times in Matthew where he quotes Hosea 6, right? When he says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He doesn't mean I desire mercy, meaning ignoring moral boundaries, because the quote in Hosea very much is exhorting the Israelites of his time to observe moral boundaries. It's not about whether there are moral boundaries or aren't, or whether we can or can't observe them. It's about what I talked about before a couple of classes ago about what the Jews have called the halakhic disputes. It's about the way in which, right? So God does want us to observe moral boundaries, but there's it's for the purpose of extending mercy to the world. And when you then follow the letter in a way that absolves you of mercy because you're just appealing to the law and saying, I don't have to be merciful to you because here's this rule over here. And Jesus is like, no, that entirely missed the point. But Hosea said the same thing 800 years before Jesus, and Jesus is just saying, like it was true under Hosea, it's still true now, that if you're using the law to absolve yourself of merciful behavior, you've missed the point of the law. It doesn't mean you get rid of the law, it just means you've missed the point. Right? Which is also why Paul talks so often, about the circumcision of the heart, the internalization of the law, which again, also in the prophets, what does Jeremiah 31 say? There is coming a new covenant, and what happens in the new covenant? The law then gets written on the heart. It doesn't mean it goes away, it just means that there's a sort of way in which we carry the moral imagination of Jesus with us as we live the way he's called us to live, which is not the same of absolving yourself from it or using it to abuse and beat people over the head with it either, but it also doesn't mean it's relativized or goes away, right? So yeah, really good, helpful. Yeah.
I liked how you talked about forgiveness being self-inflicting, and how oftentimes we speak of forgiveness as like this negative, like psychological negativity that we just have to let go of that'll really help us out, which is kind of true in some sense, but I like how you identified, I guess just zoomed in on it being like intentionally not like that, and it's actually like you have to give something up and it's painful and it hurts.
yeah, like forgiveness for the sake of the offender. Yeah, I appreciated that too. Yeah.
Oh, real quick on that. One of the most recent examples I saw of that the thing I'm trying to argue against was actually, the comedian Steve Harvey. He talked about that, where he said, you don't forgive for the other person. You forgive other people for yourself. You forgive other people so that you don't have to carry that burden anymore. And I appreciate what he's trying to do. He wants people to be able to be free of the pain. But I mean, Jesus is the model of forgiveness, and he very much took whatever we were supposed to take, he took so that we wouldn't have to. And so when he models forgiveness, if we forgive as he forgives, then it very much is about us having to take that pain upon ourselves. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, I was the offended party, but I'm still going to forgive you in such a way where I then have to absorb your offense so that you can be free. We do it to free the other person, the offending party. Yeah. Very good.
I wasn't sure if I understood you correctly on this, but there were several places where you were talking about people who have no part with Jesus or fail to qualify for the inheritance and things like that. In page 145, for example, it says Jesus makes clear that those who fail to show mercy will be disqualified from the inheritance of eternal life. We do not want to limit the confines of God's grace, but neither do we want to pursue lying or fail to appreciate the faith of Jesus and expectations and some other parts. And I was wondering, the scripture that you quoted there, Matthew 23:13, to enter into the kingdom, how the Pharisees and scribes are not entering in and preventing others from entering in. I saw that was in the present tense, middle voice indicative, not future tense, suggesting that this is not a finalized judgment and that they're not able to enter in, but they're not currently doing so and not allowing others to do so. So I was wondering, does sanctification have a role in this? Later on, I think also I had other notes on it, but it's relevant quite a bit. But there's other parts as well where you use kind of language where they have no part with Jesus or something like that. But it seems like sanctification is not mentioned here, or these people who precisely don't show mercy can be transformed to show mercy. The ones that are not pure in heart can be transformed.
But then if they get transformed to show mercy, then they become the merciful. Right? I mean, to me, it's like literally that simple. It's sanctification. I don't bring up the theological concept of sanctification, but the idea is, I think, inherent in what I'm saying, that those who have a part with Christ are developing Christ likeness because they're following him. So if they are on the process of sanctification, as you're describing, then they are in that group that is entering into the kingdom, right?
Related to that, on the part about purity, it says, impure cannot mix with that which is sacred, although impurity can exist in the realm of and is incapable of entering into God's presence. And I was wondering, because there's a lot of examples where the impure actually do enter into the presence of God, like Moses entering into the holy ground, Isaiah before being cleansed by the burning coal, Psalm 51, Jesus with the demon-possessed man in the synagogue, the leper, the bleeding woman, Saul on the road to Damascus. So I think all these are examples of undeserving and impure people entering or being entered into the presence of God, rather than being pushed away, destroyed, or judged, and are purified by the grace and holiness of God, not just in the New Testament after Jesus comes as Emmanuel, defeating impurity, but as shown in the examples above, many times in God's redemptive history before the incarnation.
Yeah. So it's a good clarification, so I'm glad you're asking about that. So is there a difference between certain modes of God's presence, right? So you talk about, for example, Moses entering holy ground, the burning bush, but that's also the same Moses that was not allowed to look at God's glory in a particular way. It had to pass by him, and he saw it only from behind. So there are modes of God's existence. I think the purity of heart, what I'm trying to talk about there, is far more similar to what Hebrews talks about, where, and this is going to sound controversial, so I'm going to maybe push you back on your heels a little bit, and then we'll try to clarify this in a future class. But we will talk about it in a future class. I'll try to clarify it. You can decide then if you agree with me or not. Right, so, well, we're talking about this in 2 future classes, because we're going to have a whole week where we talk about 1 Corinthians 15 and a whole week where we talk about Hebrews, and it's in both places. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that the perishable cannot enter into the kingdom of God. It has to become or be transformed into something imperishable so that it can enter the heavenly space. Why? Because perishability has a corruptibility to it, a lack of purity that needs to be cleansed so that it can enter the heavenly space, because that's where God's presence dwells in a particular way in which it doesn't in other places. It doesn't mean God's not present everywhere, because he is. He's in here. There's a lot of impurity in this room, and I think God's with us. Right? So there's a way in which certain kinds of presences of God, or the ultimate presence of God, is described, and I think the purity of heart is getting more at that. Hebrews also talks about this with Jesus himself, and this is where maybe it pushes you on your heels a bit. It even says, Hebrews itself says of Jesus himself, that he had to be resurrected to take on an indestructible life so that he could then re-enter the heavenly throne room. That although Jesus was morally right and morally pure and never morally sinned, his body was still subject to the decay and impurity. And according to Hebrews, in that physical state, the Son of God himself could not have re-entered heavenly space, that the resurrection purified the body and brought it from impurity to purity, or perishability to imperishability, so that he could then re-enter the presence of God. That he, even the Son of God himself, had to have a recreated body. So I'm talking more about that kind of thing on purity of heart, the ultimate ongoing kind of presence of God in that sort of a sense, rather than the momentary, like the burning bush commissioning Moses for a purpose or something like that. I mean, even to the degree that we talk about like Isaiah being brought into sort of the throne room of God in some meaningful sense to receive a commission, is not quite the same as the purity of heart that will see God for all of eternity or something like that. So I'm trying to maybe make that distinction, and maybe I didn't make it as clearly as I could have, so that's helpful. But yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. Yeah.
In your discussion on the job interview where the guy asked you if you had any enemies, just after that, I don't know if I disagreed with it, but it made me wonder with like Irenaeus specifically, where he writes to the people and it's like, "Don't help me. This is my best chance at martyrdom." Is that wrong to desire? I mean, because like he's not doing anything illicit to invoke persecution per se, but as a result of the virtuous living in the name of Christ, like he receives it, and then like Romans 5:3-4 makes me think, how much can we desire that without it being like, I want to be?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, right? Because it borders